Well-organized satanic groups are creating a reign of death and destruction which cannot be ignored.
I just want the paper, the deucer.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Radio Free Lemuria, but this time it's going to be a touch different. I know I've only focused on Gravity's Rainbow up to now, but that's not the entire point of that so-called podcast that I made. It's just all I like to talk about most of the time, so that's what I do. But if you haven't noticed, I also like reading and writing about philosophy. And recently, I have come to realize I really, really love the pre-Socratics, and I respect Plato, but I don't enjoy reading him so much. So think at this point, I've only published the two episodes, I believe, of the trial and death of Socrates, with the next one's coming soon after. And then I got to Theaetetus, and it stumped me a bit on what to write about in terms of the general trend of this project, which was to analyze the Western Empire that grew out of certain Western philosophers like Plato. And when it comes to epistemology, I feel like that's a difficult thing to talk about, and it's a difficult thing to write about. And so I thought, why not get someone that I know who knows quite a bit about philosophy and who knows quite a bit about ancient Greece and the philosophers or writers of the time, and to have him back on for the third time. So here we are again with David Patrick Gallagher to talk about Plato's Theaetetus. Hello, David.
Hello, it's me, guy who is apparently the one who knows things about Plato and ancient Greece. Do I? Let's find out.
Let's. First thing I want to ask you is this is kind of, I wouldn't say it's well, I guess it is the foundational text of epistemology in a way. Obviously, there's some like fragments that exist beforehand, like from pre-Socratics. I think Xenophanes and was it Parmenides? It was some of the other ones, like Empedocles and all of them, who had some basic epistemological thought, talking about how perfect knowledge is not possible, things along those lines. But I do think that this is the first foundational work of epistemology we have, like in total, like in full. And I was wondering, if you were to define epistemology, how would you define it?
Um, I would define it as the study of knowledge and the possibility of knowing things. For better or worse, I think the questions Rene Descartes in his Meditations is asking is a good sum up of what it is, regardless of how you feel about the guy or his process.
Hmm.
I think that question, like, I think it sort of all jumps off from the question of can we really know anything? And if we can, how? And if we can't, well, what do we do then?
Okay. And I think the beginning of Theaetetus I have some of this written down, but has three major claims that it sets out from. And these, like with Plato, of course, like they go into the very nitty-gritty of every single claim they make. But the first three claims that I believe it's that Socrates makes at the beginning of this is they go with like basically they just accept these as fact. And these three claims are the wise are wise due to wisdom. Sorry, it's a weird phrase, but the wise people, I guess I should say, are wise due to wisdom, which seems pretty self-explanatory, I guess. The second one is that learning leads to an increased wisdom on a topic. And the third is that wisdom and knowledge are equivalent. They're the same thing. And do you think that any of these three things, one of these three things, requires a bit more explanation? Or do you think there's a reason that they kind of just accept these as fact without delving too much more into them before going into like how do we acquire knowledge and what knowledge is?
Um, I mean, I think that there's sort of two questions operative there. The first is, does it make any sense why they would start off from these like assumptions? And the second one being, how do you feel about the assumptions at all? I think it makes sense why they would do this. Like, because I actually think one of the most important parts of this um whole dialogue is the question of can we even define words? And it seems like if we can't define words, then it becomes almost impossible to lay out anything on certain terms.
Right.
So it seems to me like I can understand why you would, from the starting point, define some words because it allows you to skip over that question of how do we have a discussion about these topics if we can't even operate with definitions of words. And so if we're just simply defining wise people as wise, like it's very reminiscent to the idea, I guess, of axioms in math. Like we gotta
Right.
just like whether or not these things are actually like 100% impossibly falsifiable. It is a functional jumping off point for the project you are working on.
Right.
And yeah,
Yeah, and I think it also ties back into his forms, which he largely goes into in Phaedo, which I have a bit of a gripe with, I guess, because clearly, like you said, with axioms in math or any sort of like physical science, you have to kind of start somewhere and accept something as fact, unless or else you're never going to build anything off anything. But the forms always were kind of a bit of a weird one for me, where you're defining like beauty as a form, which is clearly a societal standard, or so many societal standards as these inherent forms that just exist in the natural world or the supernatural world or the what preternatural world or whatever world they might exist in. But um, I think that, yeah, I think you're right in that he's kind of starting with these supposed axioms, which I think takes us to like the first possible criticism, like that wisdom and knowledge are the same thing, that wise are wise due to wisdom, and that knowledge occurs due to learning about a certain topic. I think we can all in this society say, like, yeah, all of those are pretty much true, but without any deeper analysis of them, that kind of leads us into like the first possible criticism of where the entire argument leads. And the entire argument is based on, I guess, the question that I think it's that Socrates asks Theaetetus or that Theaetetus asks Socrates, but I'm not really too worried about the historical or the literary accuracies here on who's asking the questions. But the major thing they're trying to decipher is like, what is knowledge and how do we acquire knowledge? And initially, Theaetetus is giving Socrates these examples of what he thinks knowledge is, and he's talking about very specific topics. And Socrates is basically saying, like, dude, I do not care about knowledge in specific topics. We're not talking about how smart you are in mathematics, how smart you are in metallurgy, how smart you are in animal husbandry, or any of these very niche topics. We're talking about what is knowledge in general. And I know we defined epistemology, but this is kind of the place where I understand what epistemology is because we are not talking about specifics. We want to know what is knowledge, how do we gain knowledge, how much knowledge on a certain topic can we have, and so on. And I think that I initially, when I came across the field of epistemology and when I was initially reading this the first time, um, it feels like a very I don't know. It feels like a very pretentious kind of realm of philosophy because I'm like, okay, why do we really care about these specific topics? Why epistemology when something like metaphysics seems so much more pertinent? But then obviously I'm getting to into reading it a little bit more, and I feel like knowledge is obviously the center of where our leaders or where the people who live in the society base their beliefs on. So again, what better place to start than what is knowledge and how does one acquire it? So I want to start by going through their three major definitions and refutations of what knowledge is. And the first one that's presented is that knowledge is perception. Sorry, I said that weirdly. Knowledge is perception. And what do you think about this definition or how they go about arguing for it at first or even against it later?
so I think that this is I mean, this one I think is sort of vital because, at least to me, a key part of how I've been reading Plato and really all of Greek philosophy and to some extent all philosophy lately is for what politics are explicitly or implicitly being utilized or are both in the background and being made possible by it. I think the way I read the idea of knowledge as perception is sort of built around this question of, so, not question, sorry, is built around this idea that if knowledge is perception, then what is known is simply that which any given person perceives. It sets up a sort of relativity between the thing perceived and the person perceiving, where now, like, this is where we are creating knowledge from. Um, to start using annoying philosophy terms, it's effectively sort of arguing something along the lines of like an early empiricism, just that what we know is what we acquire by our senses. That's that. That's all like we have access to, and we're creating knowledge out of that. I think that that is super important for two reasons. One is that it would pretty much, or it could deny there being anything beyond what we can perceive with our senses. There would be a question of where you're even getting forms from, or how forms, like in the way Plato wants to work with them, could possibly exist if all knowledge is coming from perception. I think there's also a separate question of, and this is the one they really get into. How do we judge the quality of perceptions when implicitly that would make all perceptions of all people, which is the important part, equal, but also there are errors. Like, on the one hand, maybe it's banal to say, like, everyone knows what red is because they perceive red. Of course, that's also untrue because certain people are colorblind or entirely unsighted, and that's going to lead to a completely different experience of that perceptual object and a completely different understanding of what red is. And I mean, there's a valid question there of, are some people wrong, or is that just because a majority has defined their position as the correct one, ergo everyone else is incorrect? So I think the big thing that stands out to me here is, how can things be incorrect if all knowledge is perception? And also, what does it mean? Like, how is the standard of correctness being set?
Yeah, I mean, that's also interesting because I think now that with more advanced technologies, we can technically, this is big quote unquote, technically define red as like a form of light on the electromagnetic wavelength spectrum at a very specific range of wavelengths. And this is defining it as something that's really not perceivable without the tools that we have created in our society now. And so knowledge as perception now takes on kind of a different meaning because it is different to everybody, or at least different to most people with different abilities or with different forms of perception. And then this is taking it completely to a different realm. But then we're talking about things that don't have one clear answer when we're getting into anything like the humanities or like philosophy. But going back into something that's more like tangible and more singular or has a singular answer like the color red, now perception and it has a whole new thread that we can take, like how do we observe things with these new technologies that we have developed, right? Gold used to be well, this brilliant shiny malleable object that we'd like to make jewelry out of, and now we know, well, actually it is a thing that has a very specific number of protons and these very specific properties, these atomic properties or molecular properties, if we're talking about larger objects. And so perception has completely changed in the modern era. And all of that to say is that Plato uses this example of cold wind, where people's perception of wind is different, where someone might say, "Oh, the wind is pretty cold today," and someone might say, "I think it's really nice out, actually." Very few people would probably go to the other end of the spectrum where they're like, "God, it's hot out," if it's like a cold wind at 60 or 50 degrees. But nonetheless, it is true that people's perception of something is different. And from that, they proceed on into something where they proceed on into talking about Heraclitus and Parmenides, which I think are two very interesting well, one of them, Heraclitus, is a pre-Socratic, and the other one, Parmenides. Is it Parmenides? No, no, Protagoras, right? Yes, it was Protagoras. Sorry. One of them, Heraclitus, was a pre-Socratic, and the other one, Protagoras, is the sophist, I guess the most famous sophist. And he compares their two ideas to get this idea of perception going. Heraclitus says that everything is in flux at all times, everything is always changing. And Parmenides, or Protagoras, I'm going to keep getting that wrong. Protagoras says that man is the measure of all things, aka man is the one who decides on what is what. But it's an interesting choice to use Protagoras here. I think that Plato is doing it in sort of a sarcastic way because he obviously hates the sophists. Because the whole reason that Protagoras was using man as the measure of all things is because he was teaching students specifically to be able to manipulate their people who are listening to them into believing this way rather than that way about any sort of topic. And I don't think he's trying to manipulate people to think that cold wind is actually warm or lukewarm, but he's trying to convince them of these knowledges of, or these ideas that are present in the political systems of Athens at the time, which were, as we've talked about individually, very, very, very fucked up due to uh, the rampant slavery and subjugation of pretty much anyone, I guess you could say. It wasn't a specific race necessarily, but anyone who could be who was captured in a war or who was just deemed less desirable could become a slave. So if we were able to manipulate perception, and we're talking about like perception of ideas or perception of politics, it feels like Plato is, or I guess Socrates or Plato are kind of using this in a sarcastic way to show that knowledge is not perception. The fact that we can consider knowledge to just be perception could pose these incredibly horrifying and problematic ideas. Do you think that that's why Protagoras was brought up here? And do you have any thoughts on the allusion to Heraclitus as well?
Well, I guess regarding Protagoras specifically, especially in the context of you bringing up slavery, because, well, especially these days, that's where my research and just interest in the Greeks is mostly focused on. Um, I want to start with just noting something from page on my document. It's 80, it's like about a quarter of the way through. Protagoras. Socrates says, in the context of the fact that like Protagoras has the line, man is the measure of all things. I think also this is one of those times where you should very intentionally use the word man and not switch it out for humankind, because he is specifically talking about men who are the only people who can be citizens of Athens.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think we want to be broadening that term because it will obscure what some of the implications are back there. Um, so if man is the measure of all things, so on and so forth, should Protagoras be preferred to the place of wisdom and instruction and deserve to be well paid? And we poor ignoramuses have to go to him if each one is the measure of his own wisdom. I think an important thing to note on sophistry, well, two things. One is that historical Plato was, sorry, not Plato, historical Socrates was probably, for all intents and purposes, a sophist as well. Just one who managed to pick up a certain staying power for any number of reasons. I don't exactly, as to be completely honest, I'm not totally clear where the scholarship's at these days on where Socrates ends and Plato begins. Other than I could say there was a long history across cultures of guys attributing their ideas to a dead famous guy to gain cultural cachet. Um, but sophistry was a competitive industry. Like, these were citizens of Athens who were effectively like something a cross between street preachers and teachers, um, who are trying to give people instruction in rhetoric and like a sort of logic and the ability to make compelling arguments about topics of import because, and this is super important, Athenian citizens, who again are all free men of who can trace their descent from Athens, that citizenship is effectively barred from immigrants. I've recently been learning that there is actually a long-standing myth that the Athenians are the only people of ancient Greece who are wholly indigenous to Attica. This is like it's so prevalent that people outside of Athens by and large went with it, even though it is not true at any point in the slightest. I mean, like for example, Aristotle, pretty big, important dude, big, important enough that he was Plato's top tier student and then went on to like be Alexander the Great's personal tutor. Couldn't be a citizen of Athens. He was a
Hmm.
foreigner. Didn't matter what he did, man was not getting citizenship. So, what did a citizen of Athens do with their day? Mostly they were hanging out, doing their thing. Ostensibly being a farmer, I think the jury is out on how much active farming they were doing versus owning slaves. They were definitely doing the latter. Like these men all had slaves doing labor for them. There are subsequent questions cutting across different classes of Athenian citizenry as to how much actual work um different citizens were doing. Of course, not all citizens were equal in wealth either, so it would have been variable as well. But a large percentage of what an Athenian citizen would get up to in a professional sense, mobilized by the fact that they were all slave owners, which gives you a decent amount of free time, was engaging in the political life of Athens. A democracy is the word they use for it, and without going on a separate tangent, I think maybe kind of works, as it were.
Yeah.
But being able to argue before courts, before the government, being able to make a compelling legal and or political argument was a key part of Athenian citizen life. So the teachers were fighting over who was going to be the best one because you got paid to do this. So I think part of the argument against Protagoras is if Protagoras is right, is he a good teacher or do we not need teachers because we are all intellectually equal? Second problem, if we are all intellectually equal, what does this intellectually equal mean? And who's this we again exactly? Because we is a pretty flexible category. Is it we, the citizenry, the indigenous Athenian men? Is it we men? All people who would have been recognized as men at that point in time? Um, is it, and what would that mean? Because what I can tell you is that there were definitely male slaves. And I was actually earlier this week reading a book that I am so sorry I am blanking on the name of. Andrew, I'll tell you after the fact.
Okay, cool.
But it was about slavery and honor in ancient Greece. And and one of the points this book made is that the humanity of enslaved people was perpetually ambiguous, but that ambiguity is important because they were never fully dehumanized. Um, it's again important to note that while there were ethnic and debatably proto-racial, I don't want to start playing games with terms I'm not prepared to work with, aspects to slavery. Slavery wasn't the phenotypic black-white slavery of, say, the of Western chattel slavery of modernity. Um, which is to say, the line between enslaved person and free person was already perceptually closer. And so, if these people were, in fact, people were considered human beings to some extent, if we're all equal, do we really get to, why do we get to tell them what to do again? Like, there's real implications there. Like, how can we define equal? Like, again, it's just that if individuals are the measure of all things, we really crack open questions of how are we defining individuality? And one of the underlying problems there is how do we define individuality such that only the people we want to be measuring things still get to measure things, i.e., the property owning men of Athenian citizenship.
Hmm. And that, yeah, 'cause I also think that ties into a lot of the a lot, and this is tying into my other projects, but tying into a lot of what Mason and Dixon, Thomas Pynchon's Mason and Dixon is talking about in terms of history and the formation of history, because the formation of history that we're often told is the person who is able to, or who has the power to measure history and to write it down, when in reality, a lot of the history that we read is specifically written down to affect our knowledge and to affect how we perceive our country or our state or the world, when in reality that was purposefully manipulated by these men in power who measured what history is. And it completely takes away the any incentive, or I guess any of the possibility of interpreting history or interpreting the world or the country through the lens of someone who is currently suffering or being oppressed within that country or within that history. A lot of what Pynchon is talking about in, I think I'm on the, gosh, what is it? I think I'm on the last chapter now of Mason and Dixon. And I think it was being talked about in this chapter, where the people who can truly understand and tell us about America are the slaves, and are the in our modern era are the black men and women and children who are living in a lot of the what are essentially the open air prisons of this nation. That they're the ones who can tell us what America really is, and yet we tend to hear about America through the lens of, again, those like Protagoras, or those like the people who Protagoras taught, which allegorically, I guess we could say, are through the writers of history and through the students of history. Um, and so I guess Plato and Socrates, I'll always get them mixed up whenever I'm talking about them in Plato's dialogues, but they kind of move on from the idea that knowledge is pure perception, because as we've been talking about, it clearly can't just be that. A lot of people would like us to think it might be that, but it clearly can't just be pure perception. So they go on to their second definition, being that knowledge is true judgment. Knowledge is true judgment. I guess not just true judgment. Knowledge, I should say, is perception with a true judgment, that is only possible through the not acquisition, but through the possession of a soul, i.e., that you can sense something and then you have a reaction to it, or have a belief of it, a judgment of it that is quote unquote. And I actually do think in a lot of the scholarship on this, they do have quotes around the word true judgment. So this is based on, I think it's important to read Phaedo, or to understand at least the forms that Phaedo discusses before this, because in Phaedo, Plato's talking a lot about the forms, and he's talking about how do we achieve ascension of our soul? How does our soul ascend to not heaven, I guess, but to whatever realm or world the Greeks had in parallel to that. And the soul is what gives us the idea of these forms, the idea of what beauty might be, of what even something as simple as tall might be, these very specific forms of which knowledge can kind of be a part of. And I think it's important to talk about how, or to mention how Plato doesn't necessarily say that knowledge is a form in this dialogue, but I think he's always hinting at the fact that knowledge can be a form, especially here with the idea of true judgment. Because, like I said, he's saying that in order to have a true judgment on a something you perceive, you have to have a foundational baseline, which I think he is referencing is these so-called forms. And in order to understand what these forms are, you need to have a soul. what do you make of this second definition? Because I think there's a lot to be said about him and Phaedo talking about these forms, which are societal standards in reality. But I also think there's a lot of to be said about just the soul in general. Do you think there's anything that we can also criticize in this in regard to the formation of the empire that he is either contributing to or fighting against?
I think this is one of those points that there's a lot of different ways you could take it, and there's a few that I am still working out where I come down on them. I think one thing, just as a starting point, that really stood out to me in this dialogue, and it reminds me of some other moments in Plato that really intrigue me, um, and this is on, just for context, I'm using a download of the Gutenberg press file. Shout out to Gutenberg for whatever they bring to the table.
They're great.
Page 93 of that PDF, if you're following along at home and need a free copy, it's on there. Um, where on page 93, um, Plato makes a somewhat surprise appeal to God.
Mhm.
Um, and I think this is a thing that crops up at times, in Plato, which is that he will implicitly or explicitly, or kind of blurring those lines by a very sharp pivot, appeal to effectively divine power in the face of the fact that he doesn't actually know, as it were. Like, I think there's a way of saying that, like, that's kind of what the forms are in a way. You're effectively appealing back to divinity. Again, sometimes he's referring explicitly to God. I think that this is interesting because it becomes a way of securing truth that doesn't actually demand logical justification. Um, because at the end of the day, if you're going to have faith in God, you can simply default back to guy up there says so. And did you see that guy who got zapped by lightning? I'm not taking chances either. Side note, if I didn't know how lightning worked and I saw my buddy get zapped by lightning, I would probably worship Zeus too. So I'm not like even criticizing religion here. I'm just saying it can be pretty effective and I can understand the appeal. Um,
Right.
but I think there's a lot of questions there and there's a lot to ask about what exactly is the appeal to God doing. The reason I wanted to highlight it in Plato, at risk of leaping around a bit, it reminds me of his simultaneous in The Republic criticism of poetry and his simultaneous youth of myth and fable. Only because I only mentioned this because Plato's issues with poetry and his implicit and his claim, I think they're in a certain sense empirically correct. The bigger question is how do you feel about what he makes of them? The
Mhm.
short version being like a really good story can really work the crowd.
Yeah.
Like people loved the Odyssey.
Mhm.
So how you're going to feel about the Odyssey as like a political operator such as Plato is probably going to come down to do you support how people are being impacted by that poem less than how you feel about the fact that people are being impacted by poetry at all. Because that one's a given. Like, and I mean poetry in a very large sense, like that fades entirely into theology.
Mhm.
Um, if you can get people to believe, that's going to have some big political implications. And if you're a politically engaged individual, what belief can get people to do is going to matter to you. So I think one has to ask with the way Plato is defaulting to God, if it's whether this is and I don't have an answer to this. I'm not sure answering it explicitly is possible or even necessary. Is whether Plato is a sincere believer in some divine higher power, be it the forms or something even beyond that, the traditional Olympian gods, something else. Greek religion is complicated. There's also a lot bound up in mystery cults at this time that are not proto-Christian in any like direct sense, but do fall within a broader spectrum of Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern mythology that would allow you to appeal to a god as as the basis on which to justify truth. And whether or not Plato appeals to that, whether or not Plato sincerely believes in that, the appeal to that god seems to be a useful weapon to secure truth. And maybe destroying truth outside of the possibility of God is a useful way to get people onto the God that you want running the show. Um, because if you can effectively break truth down to the point that the only way we can have epistemology is if we have faith in this God, people might get freaked out if they can't know things and are going to start believing in your route to the possibility of knowledge as a salve against the fear that you can't know things.
And I think that goes right back to Protagoras, which even though they technically disproved the initial definition, which was using Protagoras as an example of man is the measure of all things. Man can also not just measure all things, but man can determine which God or which religion is the right religion to base the foundational forms of knowledge or the forms of anything off of. And I think Protagoras specifically was a I can't remember if he was an atheist or an agnostic, but it doesn't really matter because the sophists as a whole were willing and able to teach these rich men, the men who were able to pay hundreds of thousands of modern dollars in order to be students, were able to use their knowledge to manipulate those who were listening to them. And since man is the measure of all things, man doesn't necessarily have to believe what they're preaching as long as what they're preaching is able to make someone else believe what they're preaching. And that could be a god, that could be anything. I think they are talking about what is the example that they use, like a wax tablet in there's two like cool allegories that I think Plato uses to kind of refute this. There's the wax tablet and there's the aviary. And this is where they start discussing false belief. So I'm slowly moving us on to that third definition over here. But the wax tablet is specifically as if like our knowledge base is this quote unquote wax tablet, where you have impressions upon the wax tablet that form our memories, but that the wax tablet itself is the thing that holds on to these memories. And even though we might all have our own wax tablet, the form of the wax might be different in all of us. There might be a very hard wax that holds on to these beliefs, or there might be a very soft wax that over time begins to lose the impressions, or the impressions begin to fade away. And then there's the aviary example, which I think more ties into Protagoras. And the aviary example is, what if you're in this big aviary, these flying birds or these flying ideas everywhere, and you know what to reach out for, but you have all these other false beliefs put inside of your head, that sometimes when you reach out for one that you think you know you're reaching out towards, there might be one very similar to it that you accidentally grasp. And this places a potential false belief in your mind, which does lead us on to our third definition. But I do want to finish up with Protagoras here a little bit. And so these sophists who were impressing upon our wax, or were giving us these potentially false beliefs, are in turn making our true judgments not so true, which is what ends up negating this definition specifically. Because what if what we've been told has been close enough to the truth that it's something we eventually come to believe. And when we reach out to grasp that piece of knowledge about how our nation or how our world has formed, what we're actually grasping onto is uh, a something close enough in terms in what they would consider, yeah, no, they know the truth, but in reality has been purposefully changed in such a way so to make us believe in a false truth that really just reinforces the reach and the beliefs of the empire or of the god that they want us to believe in. And before we move on to that third definition, did you have anything to add to that, to the aviary or Protagoras in general, or the second definition?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think you captured it really well. I think I think this section is important too because it is setting up the prospect of different capacities for judgment. And I personally, this is everyone's homework that I'm assigning them. I personally struggled to figure out what exactly the basis is that these blocks of wax are different for different people. Like he mentions, some of them are harder, some of them are softer, and these have specific implications for how individuals' memory and judgment function. Um, I had a lot of trouble figuring out if he ever put forth a justification for that, or if he was just like, this is the case. Um, so if anyone wants to find out for me, feel free to. Feel free to come tell me, or just take that information and use it to your own purposes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
leave it in the
but I
comments too.
did. Yeah, hell yeah. I just wanted to flag that I think there are interesting implications whether or not he justifies that, like how is he justifying this inequality? Or if he's just taking this inequality as a given. That's pretty important too, that he's now just implicitly setting another axiom, which is that some people's brains work better than others. And I
Right.
think whether or not that is an axiom or justified, figuring out the nuances of that are important. So yeah, if you could figure it out, let me know. I'd be curious because right now I read it as axiomatic.
Yeah. And like I said, leave it in the comments if you ever come across this episode and have some thoughts on this. But the idea of false belief is what leads us to our third definition. So what they basically ended up determining was that definition two, knowledge is perception with true judgment, is not correct because true judgment would basically be saying that there is no false belief because we have these axioms that we can base things on, but obviously people do have false beliefs, which, I mean, that in and of itself can be talked about quite a bit. But in order to save time, let's move on to that third definition. And so, what Socrates ends up proposing is that knowledge is true judgment, but with what he calls with an account. And what he means by an account is with an account of what the false beliefs are. At least that's how I was reading it, or an account of why the true belief is true. So not only do you have to, one, perceive something, but you also have to have a true judgment on that thing, aka use the forms to make that true judgment on a thing, but also have to have knowledge then of either A, the false judgments that are possible within the realm of knowledge that you are looking at, or an account of why the true belief is true. And this account, I guess, can be read in a few ways. It can be read about previous study, previous knowledge, experience in life, and so on. And this definition is the final definition that they get at, which of course they also prove not to be true. But I'm curious, what do you think about this idea of false belief then being equated into how we know things or how we acquire knowledge? Do you think false belief is enough, or do you think there's a reason why they refute this one at the end as well?
I guess the big thing that sticks out to me is that, so I think the question, this is actually super helpful from page 120 on the Gutenberg PDF. When, therefore, anyone forms the true opinion of anything without rational explanation, you may say that his mind is truly exercised, but has no knowledge. For he who cannot give and receive a reason for a thing has no knowledge of that thing. But when he adds rational explanation, then he is perfected in knowledge and may be all that I have been denying of him. Um, that line, I think, sort of gets at the heart of what is important about giving a rational justification, which is that in theory, you can like have an intuitive sense of something and it be accurate. I can look outside and be like, I think it's going to be warm today, or I think it's going to be cold today, without actually knowing, and I might be right. I also might be wrong, and his implication here is that you need to be able to say something more if someone asks you like, why is that the case? I just say, I don't know, vibes. Just feeling it. I feel the warmth, and then I go outside and it's cold. That's totally plausible. Or I go outside and I was right. I think his point here is that the case where I just happen to be going off vibes and and it lines up with reality isn't sufficient. And that seems important in a lot of ways, especially, I mean, if we want to go back to the political stakes of it, I think if we think about who is a citizen and who is not a citizen, and who is enslaved and who is free, keep in mind again, slavery is not going to be visible per se at this time. I am not going to say that slavery is always and anywhere or really ever entirely visible. There is at any given moment, that is an incompletely true statement. But in a society where there is no phenotypic basis for slavery, such as ancient Greece, and where enslaved people are very present in day-to-day life. For example, there's a lot of artisanal class jobs that are being done by enslaved people. In fact, banking was like some of the most important banking or bankers in the history of Athens were enslaved, at least at the start. You're going to be seeing these enslaved people very often. And at least in the case of men or people who are perceived as men, um, that is noticeable because you're going to have to deal with the fact that you might not be able to immediately tell the difference between who is enslaved and who is free, um, purely on the basis of what someone looks like. Some of the reading I've done, I looked it up. The book I referenced earlier was called Slavery and Honor in the Ancient Greek World. Would definitely recommend it. Good book. Um, it noted that there were some efforts to render slaves visible, such as a few different citations where people described slaves as looking shabby or acting in a generally lesser way, let's go with. And I think part of that is that if we can't just purely based on opinion tell who is enslaved and who is free, that could potentially cause some problems, especially when, again, this is a society where the notion is that you are able to justify your citizenship, which is a huge claim. Like the line between citizen, medic, and slave, medics, METICS, being free people who live in Athens who aren't citizens. They're probably of foreign birth or literally themselves emigrated from somewhere else. Um, you get a lot more if you're a citizen. I mean, obviously on to over enslaved people, but medics as well don't get to participate in politics. They have to be effectively registered with a citizen. They have special taxation. Um, and if your citizenship is really only definable on the basis of your lineage, well, that sounds like opinion plus justification. Like you need to be able to trace that, you you need to be able to give a pretty well laid out argument, or at least tell a really good story to justify the citizenship you do have. And these things were challenged at times. Don't forget that this was not like an uncomplicated time period in Athens. They were engaged in multiple military struggles. The golden age of Athens was again, it was relatively chaotic, and at times things were difficult for citizens, and also at times individual people's citizenry was getting challenged. And that has huge stakes for your political power. So I can see where this is coming from and why it is a justification elite men of the time would care a lot about, if
Yeah.
that answers what you were kind of hoping for.
No, I think it absolutely does. And I mean, it really does. Again, that's exactly kind of what leads us to the conclusion of this entire piece, of this entire work, is that now that definition three has been kind of refuted as well, they end up with the idea or the fact or the belief or the conclusion that no, you really can't, or at least they can't at the time with what knowledge they have, define what knowledge really is on a very literal level. And I have this note here, and I'm like forgetting if I wrote this note because this is what I thought. I'm forgetting if I wrote this note because it was a quote from the dialogue, or I'm forgetting if I wrote this note because it was a quote from a secondary source that I used. So, not to
Mhm.
plagiarize here, but I think it was mine. I wrote that what the other conclusion that they kind of came to, other than the fact that they're not going to be able to define knowledge here, is that absolute knowledge requires a metaphysical framework that cannot be rendered via epistemology as a whole. So they, in order to truly define what knowledge is, we cannot just lay within this realm of epistemology, but we have to lay with it, we have to have a framework based on metaphysics, how we exist, or I don't think they necessarily meant it in a religious way, but they definitely could be referencing metaphysics as being the Greek religion at the time. And I struggle with this one because in some sense, I think they're right. And in some sense, I also think that there are some pretty awful implications here that could come out in terms of the thesis that we're kind of going for. In terms of why it's right, I don't think that, I think it's because purely focusing on knowledge for knowledge's sake is never going to lead us to what knowledge truly is, because knowledge is so much more than just how a bunch of philosophers or dudes uh, go about kind of pretentiously talking about it. It is really how the world is perceived. And in order to perceive the world, we have to know what it means to exist within that world, or not how we were created, but just the fact that we were born out of something and born out of a, whether it's a biological framework or a historical framework and so on, right? You do need that metaphysical framework in order to even come close to understanding what knowledge is. But then again, they are talking about their metaphysical framework that they believe in. And going back to Protagoras one more time, a metaphysical framework can be manipulated, and a group of people or a country of people can be told that this is the proper metaphysical framework to base your idea of anything on. And if you're basing your idea of knowledge on a specific metaphysical framework, then your idea of knowledge, which is everything that you know, be it how many toes you have, all the way to the vast political implications of the US empire. Like, if you're basing your idea of knowledge on the metaphysical framework they want, that's kind of scary. Yeah. You have any thoughts on that?
Really, I think Your point is just a good way to explicate the what I was hinting at earlier about the appeal to God
Mhm,
and sort of the implicit in the background of all this point, which is that maybe we should. Um,
mhm,
because while I think they don't come to a compelling definition, I do think, especially if you're going at, depending on the position you're going at this from, do they give a good answer for what knowledge is? No, that's the whole point. They don't. Like, they intentionally don't. Like, Socrates' whole goal is to get to the point where it's like, we give
mhm.
up. Socrates, you're very annoying. We
Yeah.
have to go about our day. Um, I think that this is important because, again, like keep in mind some of the stuff we've talked about the political stakes of being able to have true knowledge. Um, I think it sort of means that while we don't know what knowledge is, and maybe we don't have a way of being able to have a wholly secure epistemology by the end of this, I do think he makes a very good argument for why, if we, where the we here would be the people involved in this conversation, i.e., elite citizen men of Athens who own slaves, should care because it turns out that not being able to define knowledge or not being able to have an absolutely true knowledge is a problem for them potentially.
Mm,
And so I think that is like an appeal to belief in something metaphysical or theological, be it God or the forms, or I think we're adding so many ors at this point, it really becomes a very blurred line as to what any of this is other than a effectively religious belief.
mhm.
And I think that that is sort of what he's maybe getting at. And more than anything, making the argument that why, in a philosophy being created for an elite class, they should care about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a perfect place to kind of end this. There's no clear answers. And if there are clear answers, they are mildly terrifying. Did you have any last thoughts on the dialogue? Because I think that's really all I wanted to say. But if you have any final thoughts on the dialogue or on epistemology as a whole, would love to hear them. But if not, of course, no worries.
I guess two, one, just for fun,
Hmm.
I should note that my whole big interest in philosophy got kickstarted when I was 15, and I just kind of by myself came up with the realization. There's that one line of like, how do we really know things? And could we be dreaming right now? For
Hmm.
like a year, I was constantly worried about that when I was 15. I later went on to major in philosophy. Ironically, I never took an epistemology class in undergrad.
Huh.
The strange ways life takes us. Um, but so there's definitely also just an effective dimension to this, I guess, is sort of the point there. But
Right.
the more serious point, and I think this is about why I think this is a cool project you're working on, is that for better or worse, and without uncorking discussions about canons and yada yada yada, um, that I think it's cool to be considering philosophy via Plato, because whether or not you like the guy, I mean, I personally don't. Like,
Mhm.
I disagree. Like, even when I think, oh, he makes a good point here, as you might have picked up on, I think that most, if not all of the points he makes, it's like, you see, I don't disagree with the point per se.
Mhm.
My problem is that I disagree with everything he stands for politically because he is an aristocratic slave owner. Like, I
Right.
disagree with that part. The problem is that the whole history of philosophy is written by a very, very, very long line of people, the big names of whom are very often quite well off, and if they didn't own slaves themselves, certainly weren't opposed to and maybe actively supported the ownership of slaves. The reason I mention this is that I think it's just like it's worth it to consider Plato because I think whatever useful things we take away from philosophy, it is also the case that philosophy draws a huge amount on Plato for the rest of Western history. And again, to be very clear here, I'm really speaking specifically to the philosophical traditions defined as philosophy in the West. Like,
Mm.
basically, I'm speaking of people who are explicitly following from Plato and Aristotle, or who are so steeped in the milieu who were being taught explicitly by Plato and Aristotle that even without reading one or both of those guys, that is where these thoughts are sort of emerging out of. It's important to know where that comes from because you can see the overlaps later on. I mean, if this is a foundational text of epistemology, I mean, I can see interconnections between later stuff that I've read. Like some of this read to me like, oh yeah, like that kind of reminds me of some Hegel stuff I read and things like that, or like even why I bothered to reference Descartes earlier. Like I think this is just important because th the way these terms are being set out and the game that's being played in Western philosophy is drawing on rules that Plato was writing. And I think with that in mind, it's important to know the political implications of the original rules being drawn up for the game. Because if a lot of this, amongst other things, is trying to protect an elite class and justify a society of brutal subordination of the majority of the populace, like, it might be good to ask that with just about every single philosophical text you read. Like, is that still going on here? Because if it was going on in the original stuff, even if it's well intentioned, what exactly, what do the rules of the ball game allow? I guess is sort of something I think we should be thinking about. And I think Plato is a good way of setting out the terms of what those rules are, at least so long as you're studying and asking questions about the history of Western thought.
And that all ties back into Protagoras. If man is the measure of all things, and if the man who set that measure from the start was a certain person with a certain goal, and if the society that followed that certain person who had that certain goal, if that society continues to study and believe really everything they said and bases their own foundational texts upon that, and then the next society bases their own foundational texts and laws and ideas and arts and all of the things that emerge out of society based on that, um, eventually you lose track of where it all began. You lose track of what the original society might have been like, or what the purpose for their epistemology or their metaphysics may have been. And it becomes naturalized. It becomes one of those, like, those false beliefs in the aviary that you grasp out for and don't realize that it's a false belief. You think that it is the one true belief, the true judgment, and in reality it's not. And I think that is a lot of what our society now is based on, is us grasping at these false beliefs and attempting to decipher and think about whether they are false or not. Whether it's even possible to determine what is false and what is true is now kind of a blurred line that we can not really decipher. And hopefully through the analysis of Plato through a new, I shouldn't say new, but through a different lens than is typical, hopefully that kind of unpacks some of those false beliefs to let us look at our world in a more true light, if such a thing is possible. And with that, if you have anything to plug, that I know you plugged some stuff literally last episode, but if you have anything to plug, I'd happy to let you do so.
Uh, Nothing new. Like if people are interested in me, I guess again, I occasionally use the Twitter handle _soup_65. I like soup.
Me as
I don't
well.
know. I hang out there sometimes, and I've written some stuff. Uh, yeah, that's kind of me. Uh, really just thanks for having me on again, Andrew. This is so fun to do. So glad to talk about Plato and why I hate it.
Just why I hate. So with that, yeah, that should be it. Hope to have you on again sometime.
Oh
I
yeah.
will be posting this one soon. It'll end up being out of order. I think I was gonna do Credo, Phaedo, and Cratylus first, which are all written and ready to go at some point, but fuck it. I'm just gonna post this one first, just for fun. So see it next time. Hope to have you on again for Plato or Pinchon or whomever we so choose. Thank you.
Later, y'all.